What was the weirdest, oddest, most shocking thing you found when clearing out the things of someone who passed on? My grandpa passed when I was in my 30s. A few years later my grandma was convinced to sell the house. While helping her pack, I had a vague memory that when I was about 7 he showed me a secret compartment he had built into a desk, and there was a coffee can full of coins. At that point I thought it was probably my imagination but figured I might as well check just to be sure. Ended up finding 3 coffee cans. We almost gave the desk away for free. A box labeled "Pens that don't work," full of pens that didn't work. I guess if Pop ever needed a pen that didn't work he would know right where to find one. I'm really amused by this one. I'm thinking of the fact that he probably had a bunch of pens that didn't work before he realized he needed a place for them. Then he had to find a pen that did work to label the box, and that pen probably ended up in that box afterward. There's a strain of low-level irony here somewhere. The fact that she had secretly been spending many thousands of dollars on scam supplements to cure her cancer. To all those alt health scammers preying on vulnerable people, frick the lot of yes. A friend of mine, 47 when he passed, had every closet in his house filled with vintage clothing because he was planning on opening a used clothing store. He had over 4,000 items that were sorted by style, size, color, etc. Nobody had a clue he had been procuring clothing for what must have been years. Sad he never got to do it. He should have just done house sales. I know a guy like that. He opens up his house once a month on a weekend to sell all his vintage clothes. My dad died suddenly and my mum and I were going through his old pictures when we stumbled upon an old photo from like the early 80s of a woman holding a little boy smiling. My mum and I didn't know who they were, so we called my big sister, my dad's daughter from his first marriage, and she said, "Oh, that's Brian, the son dad gave up for adoption when he was a teenager." Turns out my dad had, maybe, gotten his girlfriend pregnant when he was 16/17 and they gave him up for adoption. In the 20 years my folks were together, dad never told mum, or me, about Brian because he wasn't sure if Brian was actually his in the first place. My wife's mom had twins as a teenager and gave them up for adoption in England years before she met my wife's dad. She has always been slightly curious as to what's become of her half-siblings. We cleaned all of my grandpa's house when he died. You know what we found all over the place? Onions. Raw onions everywhere. In the bathroom upstairs next to the cleaning supplies. Their layers were popping off. Dry all over the place. No, my grandpa was not Shrek. It was the style at the time. Some old farmer died in the village I grew up in. Well, when cleaning out his farm they found a fully functional and maintained anti-tank gun. Pack 36 if I remember correctly, plus ammo. You never know when the IRS is going to send a tank for tax fraud. Go to be prepared. My grandmother was quite something. My mother less so. I had an awful childhood until I was rescued and put in a children's home when I was 14. Literally all my happy childhood memories are from visiting with my 2 grandmothers. When my maternal grandmother died, my uncle found a folder with my name on it in her papers. It turned out that as soon as she realized how bad things were for me, she got in touch with my other grandmother, and they conspired to make sure I had at least something of a childhood by both regularly inviting me to stay and showing me what was honestly the only love I experienced as a kid. I honestly believe I wouldn't have survived childhood without that conspiracy. I'm so happy they made this for you. Brings tears to my eyes. Blood thinner medicine. Lots of full unused bottles. My grandfather died as a result of a stroke and the surrounding complications. That medicine he was supposed to be taking would have reduced the chances of him having the stroke. I'll never know if he could have had several more healthy years if he had just taken his medicine. He had a list of 100 names, 87 of which were crossed off with red ink. To this day, we don't know how he was connected to them or what it meant. Found my grandpa's stash box with a setup for H and an antique vibrator, like made of brass. Wish I had a pic. I mean, I knew grandpa used to party, but dang. In my head that antique vibrator has like a bunch of gears and flywheels and is steam powered. My grandma was a child of the Depression, and as such didn't trust banks. She lived alone for years and towards the end started developing dementia. When she had to be moved for care, we found Ziploc baggies with thousands of dollars hidden all over the house, in the deep freeze, taped the back of furniture and underneath tables, in the backs of the toilet, etc. Her house was sold to placate Medicaid, and the people who bought it were her long-term neighbors who loved her very much. They called another 5 or so times when they found even more money in the floor, the cellar, the shed. I believe there is probably still money hidden that we'll never know about. She spent her last years on Social Security, budgeting every dime, and all the while was sitting on a small fortune. Thankfully Medicaid didn't know about her stash, so the family got to keep it all. This is actually pretty common. I have a friend whose husband died, and in the months following my friend found $70K plus hidden in more than a dozen stashes around their house. We found out my grandfather was an ambulance driver, medic and Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. We found his dog tags, orders, pictures and everything. He had always claimed he was in the army but stayed in California. He never talked to anyone about it, not his wife, his brothers, his children. When he passed away in '92, 2 old vets showed up and talked about him saving their life. Grandma had a bunch of burned pots and pans in her closet. She was trying to hide the fact she was going senile and didn't know if it was okay to just throw them in the trash. I'm dealing with this type of behavior with my dad right now. It's heartbreaking. Not quite the same, but our office cleaner told me about the time they lifted the carpets in their house to find a whole set of Polaroid photos from sex parties that took place in the house by the previous occupants. She said there were quite a few faces she recognized still in the village. That's a treasure. I found a letter to a man my mom was pursuing romantically and things didn't work out. She was begging and pleading with him to stay for the sake of myself and my brother. She just wanted us to have a good father figure and didn't want him to leave. It was heartbreaking to read. I think I still have it somewhere but never went to reread it. My parents divorced when I was young and my mom remarried very quickly. When my dad's mom died about 5 years later, I found a notebook in her closet with detailed notes about my mom and stepdad based on info that my grandma had gotten from me and my little sister. Apparently she was convinced that my mom was an unfit mother and that my stepdad was most definitely a child molester, and the notebook was for a lawyer because they were trying to get my dad full custody. Of course neither of those things were true, and she eventually calmed down about the situation when she saw how much we loved my stepdad. But it was still shocking for me as an 11-year-old to read a bunch of misinformed paranoid entries intended to paint my mom in the worst light possible. When my grandpa died we were going through his stuff to see if we wanted to keep anything and found an old porno paperback book. It was called something like Linda's Lusty Night. It was super corny compared to today's standards but still raunchy. Me, my brother, and cousins were reading lines of the book out loud to each other. It was hilarious. My friend inherited dozens of Mills and Boons, cheap paperback pornos. When his grandma died, he jokingly called them Mills and Poons, and burned them cause nobody would accept them as a donation. Horribly abusive father-in-law died recently. Mill left him a few years ago. Found multiple copies of her house keys and garage door openers, as well as various tools and personal belongings that he had stolen from her so that she'd need his help fixing things around her house. What a scummy manipulative thing to do. I hope your Mill is happier nowadays. My mum and dad, I was helping, were clearing out my granddad's place when I found his collection of shrunken heads he had acquired when he was in the Merchant Navy in an old box under his bed. Those are quite rare. Clearing out my Mill house we found 6 2LTR ice cream tubs full of used syringes. They were for her cat who was diabetic, but he died 5 years previously. At least she didn't toss medical waste in the normal trash. My husband's first wife died of cancer a few years before we started dating. When she died, he didn't have the time or energy to deal with a lot of her things, so he basically just packed everything up into boxes and stuck them in the basement. Years and years later, we were engaged and about to move, so we decided to go through the boxes together. We knew she was big into snowboarding, but we didn't know how much until then. We found various pictures of her out on the slopes with Jake Burton, founder of Burton Snowboards, Mike Olson, founder of Lib Technologies which produces Roxy snowboards and a few other brands, and David Kemper, founder of Kemper Snowboards. Apparently she was tight with the pioneers of snowboarding. As a keen snowboarder, this story really connected with me, especially as Jake Burton is gone now too. Thanks for sharing. This is one from the lighter side. When I was growing up, my grandfather was never into sports. He encouraged us to play and even took us to a handful of pro games, but he barely enjoyed it himself. He always said that following pro sports was nice for kids, but there's something wrong with adults who do so. When he died, my sister and me found his secret stash. Dun dun dun. It was a couple old trunks full of Boston Braves memorabilia. There was game jerseys and t-shirts, signed bubblegum cards, souvenir bats and hats, and at least 100 ticket stubs. Apparently he was as a hardcore president of the Boston Braves fan club level aficionado. When the Braves left Boston in 1952, it broke his sports fan heart in a way that he never recovered. Not the most tragic tale, and it's even a bit amusing, but it's kind of sad too. Being a Braves fan was his thing. It was his guilty pleasure, his passion, and apparently part of his identity. Then they left and he was never the same. I can definitely understand his statement about adults and kids. When you believe in something that much and it gets stripped from you, there is a degree of bitterness, resentment, and so much more so, loss. If you let your love go in your youth, you become an adult that doesn't feel the inevitable sorrow. That's just my opinion though. When my grandmother died, we were going through her closets and found a marriage license for my grandfather and another woman, dated 6 months before he married my grandmother. Apparently, he got jilted and Mima caught him on the rebound. My mom knew the woman and had never heard about a relationship between her and Granddaddy. My bio brother died when I was a teenager, and we were very close. I didn't realize how close he was to me until after his death, as I found lots of our old drawings and toys in his hope chest, as well as a small, hidden collection of my and my sister's old underwear. I still love and miss him, but that certainly threw me for a loop. This quickly went from adorable to creepy. My 90-year-old grandpa was pretty physically infirm just before he died. Mentally fine, but he had had severe glaucoma for decades and developed severe motor issues. He really needed to be in a care home, but him and my grandma had never been apart since he came back from World War II, and they didn't want to be separated now. The NHS ones could only take singles unless they both needed it, and they couldn't afford the private places or a live-in nurse. So my 78-year-old grandma basically became his nurse. It eventually got too much for her. He had a bad fall and had to be moved to the care home. She would visit him daily, but she lived in a small village and had to take the bus for an hour to get to town and see him. The second last bus stopped in the village, but the last one stopped on the opposite side of the motorway from the village. She stayed too late one night, got the last bus home, and was knocked down and killed on the motorway. We had the funeral, and a couple days later my grandpa passed away too. When we were clearing out the house, we found some bank statements my grandpa had hidden away. Turns out he'd been secretly hiding away money here and there for decades and had saved up over £200,000. He'd always been conscious that he was a lot older than my grandma and he wanted her to have a comfortable life when he died. Aside from being a massive amount of money for us, it was a shame because he could have had a much more dignified and comfortable last few years with that money, but he was too worried about her to ever have used it. My granddad did the same, except he had it in 39 different bank accounts. To this day, 3 years after he died, my grandnier is still finding more documents of random banks accounts. Spends her life on world cruises now, socializing and living the dream. My grandma had been a school nurse but had been retired for about 10 years or so at the time of her death. As we were clearing out our old office, we found index cards with dead lice on them and labeled as to which kind they were. We were all so grossed out. AWW grandma had a scientific mind and passionate about her work. When my grandma passed away, we found some crazy things, including her gallstones, a chicken bone with a note that explained how it had killed her dog at least 30 years ago, a box of mincemeat from the 1960s, iguana food. She was terrified of reptiles, and an unbelievable amount of stuff all fit into a small mobile home. We knew she was a pack rat, but never to the extent that we discovered. When my family was cleaning out the home, everyone was hiding all of the weird stuff in other people's vehicles and bags without their knowledge. I personally stuck a terribly made stuffed squirrel, we named it Zombie Squirrel, in my parents' bread box to scare the heck out of them upon their return from snowboarding. It worked. I wish I could have seen it happen, but hearing my mom describe it a few weeks after they returned was good enough. Funny thing is, my family plays Christmas bingo with cheap and funny gifts every year, and these antiques have now ended up in the rotation, ending up in someone's possession every year until they can pawn it off on another relative. I currently have the mincemeat after discovering it on New Year's Eve in a box of beer that I was gifted. It's hard as a rock but still sealed in the original packaging. So I bought some epoxy resin and I'm going to cast it inside and make a trophy out of it so this insanity can continue. We're a weird family but fun AF. This is my favorite one so far. Your family sounds awesome. At the very bottom of a drawer full of blankets we found an intensive family history book at my grandmom's house. It went back to the 1500s and had so many interesting details. How much someone's dowry was. One relative was a prisoner of war during the Civil War and injured himself to get sent home. We changed the spelling of our last name after World War I. All this was done in the 70s, I think. We all wished grandmom had taken the book out to show us. Not me. Family friend. They found a jar of sand labeled fused sand from first nuclear bomb test, Nevada, when the family patriarch died. They called up the local university and someone came out with full radiation suit and Geiger counter. The whole thing was highly radioactive. I can't really go into much detail because I'm not a lawyer and I don't want to get into trouble. But basically some documents implicating some public figures of child sex offenses back in the 1970s-80s. We passed it all over to the police and it was investigated. Some of it made the news, but it was just allegations. I am not sure there was much more than circumstantial evidence. Still, it was pretty chilling to find a file accusing various relatively high-profile officials engaging in some pretty dodgy stuff. Most of them are dead now anyway, so I doubt anything would ever come of it. Pretty sad if any of it was true. I suspect we will never know. On a more personal note, we found a little black book when we cleared out my granddad's house of payments he was making to another family. I think we suspect it was possibly an illegitimate child that he had sometime back in the 1950s. He definitely had an affair sometime after the war, so it sort of fits. Would be really interesting to track them down and find out more. But given that the payments stopped back in the 1990s, my mum and uncle decided that they didn't want to chase it up and risk unsettling somebody's life. Who knows? It could have been blackmail for something. We have literally no idea. It's a secret the old man took to his grave. I think we suspect it was possibly an illegitimate child that he had sometime back in the 1950s. He definitely had an affair sometime after the war, so it sort of fits. Would be really interesting to track them down and find out more. If you or any other family members try out 23andMe or any of the other DNA testing kits, you could uncover a match to some unknown cousins out there. My boss's father was an oil and gas engineer who has traveled the world for decades for work while the kids grew up in Texas. His family thought of him as a quiet, introverted man who spent his life earning a living for his family. When he passed, my boss went through his stuff and found evidence of dozens of affairs all over the world. My grandfather was married 9 times to 8 women. The last one he was with was for 20 plus years and was with him when he died. When we went through his office, my aunts kept her and the grandkids out. Not only pictures and videos of dozens of affairs, but orgies and swinger stuff as well. There were multiple hard drives of homemade pee. My dad was not surprised. When my grandmother died, one of my jobs following the funeral was going through all of her paperwork. We ended up finding a few fantastic things, some of which I still don't have the full story for. My 2 favorites were: 1. A personally addressed invitation to a luncheon at LBJ's White House. 2. Birthday and anniversary cards between her and my grandfather, who had been together for 60 plus years before he passed 20 years before her. They bought, and a few were handmade, cards, and would sneak the card back to the other to write a new message each year and return it. My sister and I looked through them and realized we were holding the entire history and account of my grandparents' loving marriage in front of us. It was the most beautiful example of love I've ever seen. 1. A personally addressed invitation to a luncheon at LBJ's White House. This sparked a memory of going through some of my great-grandma's things. She had her invitation to lunch or tea time with, if I recall correctly, Eleanor Roosevelt. I asked my dad why I never got to know my grandfather, his dad, after he died. My dad told me his dad was booted out of the army for massive quantities of child pee and was a pedophile. My parents would obviously not let him around me. My grandfather served with Australian Air Force during the Second World War and was based in New Guinea. He always maintained that because of the things he saw, because of what happened to friends of his that were pals, that he despised the Japanese even towards the end of his life 20 years ago. He even sneered when my brother said he was learning Japanese as a language at school. When we found his old art books, we found illustrations of Japanese people, plants and landscapes, all lovingly and beautifully illustrated and all dated from after the war. My mum, aunt and grandmother were collectively stunned. None of them had ever seen or heard of these drawings. A hand-knitted penis cozy. Apparently these were a knitting fad in the 1940s, and wives would knit them as gag gifts to send to their husbands who were away at war. They go by many names, of which Willy Warmer is probably my favorite. It's just weird to think of my sweet elderly aunt as having a sense of humor that includes penis jokes, but everyone was young and immature once. When my best friend and her boyfriend died in a hydroplaning accident, I went to clear out her house since her family was out of state. They should be grateful I disposed of literally dozens of sex toys and a bunch of lingerie. I knew what I was going in there for, but I was still surprised by the overall size of the strap-on that was prominently displayed in their room. Her boyfriend was a preacher's son, so I also took all the drug paraphernalia out of their room so that his parents wouldn't have to face harsh disillusionment with their son's party less than a week after his death. He only smoked weed, but that would have been scandalous enough to taint their memory of him. What a good friend. I used to work for an auction house that would come in after a person died, usually at instruction of their child who didn't have the time to deal with it themselves, and catalog everything then sell it. We saw amazing things. Perfectly preserved baby toys from the 20s and 30s. Sets of family china from great-great Eva's wedding perfectly packed away. One house looked like it was frozen in the 60s. No new appliances or furniture, just original style maintained perfectly by grandma till her death. The best find was a hidden archive of World War II memorabilia from when the deceased person fought in the war. He clearly hid it away from sight and mind. Back of a basement closet, we found guns, tons of medals and patches, an old uniform, and a few pictures. We called their child to ask if they wanted to keep any of this. We noted that some of the medals were very important, but they had us get rid of everything. I had to look up each one before placing it on the market, and that man saved a lot of butt in his day. I am relieved to find a comment that's not the usual combination of sex and drug related stuff everyone else is posting about. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.